This is the introductory education programme for supporters of FRFI. Its structure serves its purpose by establishing the need for organisation in order to meet the crisis of capitalism and fight for socialism. This programme is in no way fixed and is open to suggestions. It remains therefore a work in progress. It is being discussed in open forums across the country where FRFI supporters are active. In this session, we're going to look at how the struggle for socialism within imperialist countries and the struggle for national liberation in the oppressed nations work in tandem. The national liberation struggles against colonialism and neo-colonialism are an essential part of the struggle for socialism. Marx and Engels' changing analysis of Ireland and its relation to Britain demonstrated how a nation that oppresses another could not itself be free. A precondition for the advance of the proletariat in Britain was support for the emancipation of Ireland. This analysis provided a model for Lenin to develop a communist position on the right of nations to self-determination. National liberation movements combine different social and class forces. Communists support the movement and try to strengthen their working class and socialist content. This is an essential step if such movements are to achieve their objective. Where bourgeois forces remain ascendant, they will seek a compromise with imperialism. To start with, we're going to look at the article Communists and National Liberation Movements, Same Goal, Different Paths, first published in FRFI number 52 in September 1985. As communists in the world's oldest imperialist nation, the revolutionary communist group has consistently fought long and bitter struggles with the British left to establish the communist position of unconditional support for the struggle of national liberation movements against British imperialist domination and against national oppression. Our record on this, especially in relation to Ireland, is beyond serious challenge. In Britain, with its long tradition of imperialist exploitation, its strong and well-entrenched labour aristocracy, communists have always had to emphasise the goal we have in common with the national liberation movements, to defeat British imperialism. As the crisis of British imperialism deepened, with the consequence of polarisation of British class society, and as the tempo of the national liberation struggles themselves had accelerated, like Ireland in 1981, South Africa in 84 to 85, inevitably the issue of the relationship between communists and national liberation movements will present itself in new ways, raising new questions and demanding answers. So today, the very same political forces that yesterday accused the RCG of conceding to reactionary nationalism for demanding unconditional support for national struggles against British imperialism and against national oppression, are now flaunting a newly discovered solidarity with liberation movements to justify their own opportunist attempt to sustain the grip of the labour aristocracy over the working class and the oppressed in Britain. It is therefore necessary to restate the basis of the communist standpoint on the national liberation question. Lenin and the right of nations to self-determination. Under imperialism, the world has been divided into oppressor and oppressed nations, and national oppression has been extended and intensified. A split has been created in the working class movement within the imperialist countries. One section, the labour aristocracy, has been corrupted by the, quote, crumbs that fall from the table of the imperialist bourgeoisie, obtained from the super-exploitation and brutal oppression of the people from oppressed nations. The other, the mass of the working class, cannot liberate itself without uniting with the movement of oppressed peoples against imperialist domination. Only such an alliance will make it possible to wage a united fight against the imperialist powers, the imperialist bourgeoisie, and their bought-off agents in the working class movement. This means the working class fighting in alliance with national liberation movements to destroy imperialism for the purpose of the socialist revolution. The unity of all forces against imperialism can only be achieved on the basis of the internationalist principle. Quote, no nation can be free if it oppresses other nations. This is expressed through the demand of the right of nations to self-determination. This demand recognises that the class solidarity of workers is strengthened by the substitution of voluntary ties between nations for compulsory militaristic ones. The demand for the complete equality between nations, by removing distrust between the workers of the oppressor and oppressed nations, lays the foundation for a united international struggle for the socialist revolution. That is, for the only regime under which complete national equality can be achieved. The working class in the oppressed and oppressor nations have the same goal. They necessarily approach it by different paths. As Lenin pointed out, the actual conditions of workers in the oppressed and oppressor nations are not the same from the standpoint of national oppression. The struggle of the working class against national oppression has a twofold character. First is the action of the nationally oppressed proletariat and peasantry jointly with the nationally oppressed bourgeoisie against the oppressor nation. And second, it is the action of the proletariat or of its class-conscious section in the oppressor nation against the bourgeoisie of that nation and all the elements that follow. Lenin, a caricature of Marxism and imperialist economism. Lenin was accused of being inconsistent in his attitude to nationalism for arguing that the approach of the working class in the oppressor nation to this question was necessarily different from that of the working class in the oppressed nation. His reply to this criticism was simple and direct. Quote, "Is the position of the proletariat with regard to national oppression the same in oppressing and oppressed nations? No, it is not the same. Not the same economically, politically, ideologically, spiritually, etc." Meaning that some will approach in one way, others another way, the same goal from different starting points. End quote. From The Nascent Trend of Imperialist Economism. What this means is that the strategy and tactics necessary for building an effective anti-imperialist movement in Britain, the oppressor nation, may differ from the strategy and tactics required to develop the liberation movement's struggle in the oppressed nation. The RCG has long opposed all attempts by the British Labour movement and the British left to impose their own, usually opportunist, strategy and tactics on the liberation movement. Equally, the RCG is opposed to all attempts to impose the strategy and tactics developed by liberation movements to meet the specific conditions of their own struggles on the anti-imperialist movement in Britain. The example of the Lancaster House negotiations on Zimbabwean independence in 1979 makes this point clear. Communists in Britain defend the right of the Patriotic Front to enter into negotiations with and make concessions to the British government, whilst, at the same time, attacking the British government for imposing these concessions on the liberation movement. Opportunists hide behind liberation movements. On the question of Ireland and South Africa, opportunists are attempting to use Sinn Féin and the ANC to attack the RCG's approach to solidarity work. In a recent leaflet, Proletarian, a tiny and uninfluential group associated with the Morning Star, attacks the RCG's work on Ireland using a quote from a review in the Sinn Féin journal, Iris of Ireland, the Key to the British Revolution. In the same leaflet, it attacks the RCG's involvement in the City of London anti-apartheid group, and demands the disbanding of the City AA on the grounds of solidarity with the ANC. We cite Proletarian only because it is a typical example of the way in which British opportunists use liberation movements for their own narrow sectarian ends. The review referred by Proletarian appeared in Iris No. 10 in July 1985. The review contains important distortions of RCG's position on building a movement in Britain. More important for our argument here, however, is the standpoint stated in the review on solidarity work and the strongly implied attitude of the reviewer that socialists in Britain should adopt the same standpoint. The review accepts our central argument that emancipation of Ireland is a necessary precondition for socialist revolution in Britain. We are also in agreement that socialists in Britain should build on whatever support there is in Britain for a withdrawal. Where we disagree fundamentally with the reviewer is the assertion that the possibility of building an effective anti-imperialist solidarity movement in Britain is, quote, totally unrealistic expectation given the political situation for the foreseeable future. On the basis of this, the review concludes that the RCG has adopted an isolationist stance that is doomed to obscurity, end quote. This position ignores the political developments which have taken place in Britain, particularly in the last 5 years. During the crucial period of the hunger strike in 1981, major British cities saw the most significant, intense and widespread street confrontations between the oppressed black and white youth and the police. These were the most serious, spontaneous revolts in Britain in the whole post-war period. The possibility of uniting the oppressed in Britain with the Irish people in a common struggle against a common enemy was there for all to see. The opportunity was thrown away, precisely because the existing solidarity movement, led by the Troops Out movement, turned its back on these developments for fear of disrupting its, in any case, futile attempt to win the official labour movement to support the hunger strike. Rather than appeal to a section of the working class, which had a common interest with the Irish people in defeating the Thatcher government and was actually fighting that government on the streets, the existing solidarity movement adapted its campaign to avoid any exposure of its chosen allies in the Labour Party. the very people who, in government, were responsible for the hunger strike by withdrawing the special category status for political prisoners in 1976, and who viciously condemned the risings in Britain. The miners' strike in 1984-85 once again demonstrated that the deepening British crisis would produce new forces that could be won to an anti-imperialist position on Ireland. The striking miners' experience of police brutality, government manipulation and rigged courts led many of them to identify their own struggle with that of the Irish people. As the crisis develops and more sections of the working class are forced into confrontation with the British state, these possibilities will multiply. The growing political and social crisis in Britain has also revealed that the official Labour movement will move further and further to the right as its own position is increasingly threatened, a point confirmed during the miners' strike. What is indeed a totally unrealistic expectation is any belief that the existing official Labour movement can be won to a progressive position on Ireland. Comrade McAteer and the Republican movement have every right to assess developments in Britain from their own standpoint and act upon that assessment. But neither the Republican movement nor opportunists in Britain claiming to act in its name have any right whatsoever to demand that the RCG and other British anti-imperialists must accept that assessment and any conclusions that follow from it. For while we have the same goal as the Republican movement, the defeat of British imperialism in Ireland, we necessarily approach that goal along a different path. Comrade McAteer is right to say that Republicans cannot afford the luxury of waiting around until the British working class becomes sufficiently politicised to fully support our struggle in all its form. But we are equally right to expose the role of the official Labour movement and to fight against the very opportunism which not only obstructs the struggle for Irish self-determination, but also the struggle for socialism in Britain. We are also right, indeed it's our duty, to concentrate our efforts on building an effective anti-imperialist movement amongst the most oppressed sections of the working class, while at the same time working in unity with any other forces whenever possible. Similar issues have arisen in relation to the building of a solidarity movement against the apartheid regime in South Africa. The proletarian leaflet claims that Johnstone Makatini, director of the ANC's international department, has called for the shelving of differences within the anti-apartheid movement in this country, and for unity on the basis of exclusive recognition of the ANC. This is a misrepresentation of Comrade Makatini's remarks in London on the 3rd of August. He did urge unity of the AAM in Britain. He did say, as a separate point, that the ANC had initiated a campaign for what he called exclusive recognition of the ANC as the sole representative of the liberation struggle in South Africa. If the ANC chooses a campaign for exclusive recognition, that is a matter for the South African people to resolve. It is not a matter for the movement in Britain to decide, or, even worse, cynically exploit for their own narrow sectarian ends. Proletarians' interpretation of Comrade Makatini's remarks, in any case, flatly contradicts the AAM's own constitutional requirement to cooperate with and support Southern African organisations campaigning against apartheid. The AAM's constitutional position is the only correct internationalist position for organisations in Britain. For British organisations to take it upon themselves to decide only to recognise one liberation organisation fighting apartheid and not others in the same fight is British imperialist arrogance and chauvinism of the worst kind. Our task in Britain is to give unconditional support to all organisations in their fight against apartheid in South Africa, regardless of differences which may arise between different sections of the liberation movement. Unity means the democratically organised cooperation of different forces with different political standpoints in a common campaign against the apartheid regime and against British collaboration with that regime. When those in the AAM who have attacked the disaffiliated city anti-apartheid and also attack the RCG's involvement in the AAM call for unity, what they mean is the bureaucratic imposition of their own narrow sectarian prejudices on all anti-apartheid activists. Any movement in Britain which denies basic democratic rights to its own supporters cannot possibly be trusted to wage a consistent fight for the democratic rights of the peoples of South Africa. The political priority of the CPGB and its allies in the leadership of the AAM is the election of a Labour government under Neil Kinnock. They are prepared to subordinate the struggle against apartheid to this opportunist end. This is why they object to FRFI being sold in official AAM events, because it contains material on Ireland and other issues which expose the reactionary character of their chosen allies. We remind these self-styled communists of Lenin's explanation of the task of the working class in the oppressor nation in relation to national oppression, which is to oppose the bourgeoisie of that nation and all the elements that follow it. The Labour Party's record on South Africa and its record on Ireland prove beyond dispute that it is one of the elements that follow the bourgeoisie. As with Ireland, so with South Africa, unconditional solidarity with the struggle against national oppression does not and cannot oblige British communists to give up that struggle against British opportunism. Our job as communists and anti-imperialists working in the world's oldest imperialist nation is to formulate the strategy and tactics appropriate to the building of an anti-imperialist movement in Britain in solidarity with all those fighting British imperialism and national oppression.
The following article was published in issue 187, October-November 2005, a review on Alan Woods' book Ireland, Republicanism and Revolution, published by Well Read Books in May 2005, review written by Robert Clough, titled How Did Trotskyists Got It Wrong? Why review a book on Irish republicanism written by a long-standing member of the bloody, racist, imperialist British Labour Party? Because socialists need to understand the significance of the revolutionary national class struggle against imperialism and for socialism, particularly with developments in Latin America. Woods' analysis of Irish republicanism totally fails in this respect. Indeed, his book is an example of a trend which Lenin called imperialist economism, and which today expresses the interests of a narrow section of the working class, the labour aristocracy. Woods says that, quote, the only way to solve what remains of Ireland's national problem is as a byproduct of the revolutionary struggle for socialism. He continues, there can be no reunification of Ireland while the working class remains divided along sectarian lines. He concludes that it is time to put an end to the sectarian divisions that have bedevilled the working class of the north of Ireland for so long. This will be achieved by fighting, quote, on issues that unite working people, not those that divide us. But these fine words are really no more than idealist drivel, which in the end capitulates to imperialism. Lenin had to deal with a number of trends during the First Imperialist War to re-establish the principled position on the struggle for national self-determination, amongst them the imperialist economists. Lenin described, quote, the same economist refusal to see and pose political questions, end quote, continuing, since socialism creates the economic basics for the abolition of national oppression in the political sphere, therefore our author refuses to formulate our political tasks in this sphere. Lenin Collected Works, Volume 23, page 16. In particular, imperialist economists disagreed with the right of oppressed nations to self-determination because they argued it would mean capitulating to the nationalist bourgeoisie. This is exactly Woods' argument. He is of course against national oppression, but he does not translate this into any concrete political tasks. Instead, he says, in relation to partition, the border is of course an abomination that must be removed. It is not, however, the task of socialists to erect new frontiers. Our aim is altogether different. Our aim is to abolish all frontiers, not just the ones that separate the south from the north. We stand for a socialist revolution in the north and south of Ireland, and a socialist revolution in Britain and the rest of Europe. Woods, page 132. What follows from this? Frontiers, including the one that separates north and south, can only be abolished by socialist revolution. Therefore, the issue of frontiers, i.e. self-determination, should not be posed as a concrete question today because it cannot be resolved under capitalism. Hence his utterly one-sided view that, quote, the whole history of the national liberation struggle in the 20th century shows that the achievement of formal independence on a capitalist basis has solved nothing, end quote. Page 131. Woods never differentiates between the tasks facing the working class of oppressor and oppressed nations. He rejects Lenin's clear exposition of the twofold character of the struggle of the working class against national oppression. Quote, first, it is the action of the nationally oppressed proletariat and peasantry jointly with the nationally oppressed bourgeoisie against the oppressor nation. Second, it is the action of the proletariat, or of its class-conscious section, in the oppressor nation against the bourgeoisie of the nation and all the elements that follow it. Lenin's position was clear. Socialists in imperialist nations must support the right of oppressed nations to self-determination down to an uprising or war. Does Woods agree with this? You cannot find out from his book. Lenin argued that imperialist economism had both a left and a right face. Woods presents the right face. For him, anyone who engages in struggle for national independence is by definition subordinating the interests of the working class to those of the national bourgeoisie. Hence, they must be opposed and condemned. In the case of Ireland, this means attacking the IRA. Woods justifies his position by distorting Marx, Engels, Lenin and Connolly. Woods provides a very selective account of Marx and Engels' position on the struggle of the Fenians in the 1860s, one which depends almost entirely on their private assessment of Fenian tactics. He does not mention their intense public campaigning in support of Fenian prisoners, nor their challenge to English working class leaders in the First International. Marx and Engels were indeed at times very scathing about the Fenians, but only in their private correspondence. In public, they fought Woods' equivalents in the ranks of the English trade union movement. Their supporter, Dupont, argued in the International against those he called, quote, English would-be liberators, end quote, who argued that Fenianism is not altogether wrong, but asked why they did not employ legal means of meetings and demonstrations, end quote. He continued, what is the use of talking of legal means to a people reduced to the lowest state of misery from century to century by English oppression? Is it well for the English to talk of legality and justice to those who on the slightest suspicion of Fenianism are arrested and incarcerated and subjected to physical and mental tortures? The English working men who blame the Fenians commit more than a fault, for the case of both peoples is the same. They have the same enemy to defeat. Although Woods seeks justification for his position in Lenin and Connolly, as an imperialist economist, he feels much more at home with Trotsky's generalizations. Lenin, however, never adopted Trotsky's perspective. To think that he did would be to ignore his contribution to the debate on self-determination at the Second Congress of the Third International, where he pointed to the vital importance of supporting the revolutionary nationalist struggle against imperialism. There is a simple test of Trotsky's and Lenin's respective positions, their responses to the 1916 Easter Rising. Trotsky wrote, an all-Ireland movement, such as the nationalist daydreamers had expected, failed to materialize. The basis for national revolution has disappeared even in backward Ireland. The experiment of an Irish national rebellion is over, but the historical role of the Irish proletariat is only beginning. Already it has brought into the revolt, even though under an archaic flag, its class indignation against militarism and imperialism. Lenin replied, to imagine that social revolution is conceivable without revolts by small nations in the colonies and in Europe, without the revolutionary outbursts by a section of the petty bourgeoisie with all its prejudices, without a movement of politically non-conscious proletarian and semi-proletarian masses against oppression by the landowners, the church, and the monarchy against national oppression, etc. To imagine all this is to repudiate social revolution. So one army lines up in one place and says, we are for socialism, and another, somewhere else, and says, we are for imperialism. And that will be a social revolution. Lenin Collected Works, Volume 22, pages 355 to 56. Nor was Connolly a Trotskyist. He could not have made himself plainer when he asked a few weeks before the Rising, quote, is it not well unfitting that we of the working class should fight for the freedom of the nation from foreign rule as the first requisite for the free development of the national powers needed for our class? It is so fitting. Cited in Reed, Ireland, The Key to the British Revolution, page 25. Woods constantly seeks to minimalise the significance of the split in the working class in the occupied 6 counties. Every time he is forced to concede that discrimination against Catholic workers in the North exists, Woods tries to belittle its significance by saying that conditions for Protestants are also bad, examples in page 70 and pages 80 to 81. But that is not what is at issue. The split in the working class is not merely ideological, as he tries to suggest, but has a material basis in British imperialist domination, and Connolly understood its significance when he observed that, quote, the orange working classes are slaves in spirit because they have been reared up amongst people whose conditions of servitude were more slavish than their own. In Catholic Ireland, the working class are rebels in spirit and democratic in feeling because for hundreds of years they have found no class as lowly paid or as hardly treated as themselves. The doctrine that because the workers of Belfast live under the same industrial conditions as do those of Great Britain, they are therefore subject to the same passions and to be influenced by the same methods of propaganda, is a doctrine almost screamingly funny in its absurdity. End quote. Yet it is this doctrine Woods wants the Irish movement to pursue. Quote, a programme based on issues that can unite the class, jobs, wages, conditions, housing, women's rights. Only the struggle for this can succeed where all else has failed. End quote. Woods, page 126. Connolly may not have used the term imperialist economism, but this is what he was dealing with. The Woods of his day. On this subject, 1969 and the introduction of British troops. Woods just lies. He states that the Marxists and the Labour Party, quote, came down firmly against the sending of the troops to the north. They wrote at the time, quote, the call made for the entry of British troops will turn to vinegar in the mouths of some of the civil rights leaders. The troops have been sent in to impose a solution in the interests of British and Ulster big business, end quote. Page 110. But he omits to mention that the self-same article in Militant of September 1969 also says, quote, a slaughter would have followed in comparison with which the bloodletting in Belfast would have paled into insignificance if the Labour government had not intervened with British troops, end quote. So the Marxists were not against the introduction of troops at all. Indeed, 10 years later, they were describing those who called for the withdrawal of British troops as, quote, attorneys for the provost, end quote, from Bulletin, November-December 1979 issue. Needless to say, Woods makes no reference to this either. Out of countless examples of Woods' capitulation to imperialism, we will take just one. His account of the struggle of the 1970s against the criminalisation of Republican prisoners ignores the crucial role of the 1974-79 Labour government in establishing a regime of institutionalised torture and repression. Although he now seems to endorse the struggle led by the Relatives Action Committees in support of the prisoners, it was a quite different story at the time. In October 1979, Militant Irish Monthly issued a virulent condemnation of the Mountbatten and Warren Point bombings entitled Mass Action, Not Individual Terror, saying that, above all, these events have, very temporarily, stunted the rising movement of the working class just at a time when the attention of all workers needs to be focused in opposition to the policies of the Tory government, end quote. The article is silent on the prisoner struggle, let alone the role of the RACs. Woods' arguments express the interests of a privileged section of the working class, the Labour aristocracy. His defence of the Labour Party, his opposition to armed resistance to the British occupation, his rewriting of the shameful history of his organisation, his misuse of Marx, Engels, Lenin and Connolly all have a purpose: to keep opposition to British imperialism within the confines of bourgeois respectability. Together they amount to a deeply reactionary standpoint.
Again, thank you so much for listening, and for more FRFI articles, please visit our website revolutionarycommunists.org or frfi.co.uk. And please don't hesitate to get in touch about joining or finding out about our open public meetings across the country.